Thousands of German prisoners wanted to stay in America because going home had become more terrifying than captivity. Here is how it worked and why it mattered. A few 100,000 men arrived in a country that had not been bombed, and the difference was immediate. The food was better, medical care was available, and the daily fight to survive had stopped. For many, the immediate risk was no longer survival, it was whether to return to a Europe of ruins. The obvious solution, send them home, did not solve the deeper problem. Returning meant broken towns, empty fields, and families who might not be there anymore. That confusion baffled soldiers, farmers who met them, and officials trying to make a plan. But here is where it gets strange. Inside United States camps, a simple approach took hold. Small actions that were powerful. Instead of harsh treatment, camps offered steady meals, basic medical care, work alongside American farmers, and predictable days. Those modest changes gave men something they had not felt in years, a sense of safety. People assumed the answer would be grand and immediate. Send them back, rebuild fast, restore life. That failed because the foundations were gone and survival in Europe was uncertain. Most people think the difference was American abundance, but the real truth was routine and dignity. The smallest human gestures mattered more than any large program. There is another layer to this story, and it makes the choice to stay even more complicated. Most of what people assume about this is not actually accurate. The real story is quieter and stranger. Hundreds of thousands of men stepped onto American soil and discovered that captivity could feel like rescue. That unexpected consequence shaped choices, and it changed lives. When they arrived, the scale was almost impossible to grasp. Over 425,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across more than 500 camps, tucked into quiet corners of 46 states. For each man, surrender began the trip, but what waited was a kind of limbo, far removed from the chaos they had left. Back in Germany, the world they knew was coming apart. Allied bombing turned entire cities into wastelands. In Dresden, 85% of homes were gone. Cologne lost 61%. In Kassel, Hanover, and Essen, half or more of the housing lay in ruins. By 1945, nearly 7.5 million Germans had no homes, living in cellars, makeshift shelters, or simply out in the open. Food was scarce. In some months, rations dropped to 1,200 calories a day. With families picking through rubble, it is easy to see what was at risk. Out of every 100 German prisoners of war held in the United States, most came from cities where 40 to 80% of the buildings had been destroyed. The contrast was stark. While families at home sifted through ruins, these men found themselves in a country untouched by bombing, surrounded by orderly fields and steady meals. For many, the shock was not just the loss of freedom, it was the realization of how much had already been lost elsewhere. But here is where it gets strange. The safety of captivity began to look less like punishment and more like a lifeline. On screen, text reads, "This looks different up close." The mystery was obvious. The obvious fix was to send prisoners straight back to a shattered Europe as soon as the fighting stopped. Commanders and civilians assumed that was the right move. They expected unrest, escapes, and a quick return home. That plan failed to reckon with a simple fact. Steady food, shelter, and humane treatment do more than keep people alive. The forgotten shortcut was ordinary life. Regular meals, clean beds, a schedule, work in the fields or on farms. Those small routines repaired bodies and minds. They gave men a chance to breathe, to plan, to imagine a future beyond constant survival. People thought punishment or immediate repatriation would solve everything. Instead, those solutions often made the problem worse. Sending men back to ruins without resources pushed families deeper into crisis. The tiny, careful comforts offered in camp proved more effective at preventing collapse than any rushed policy. The irony is quiet but sharp. The smallest acts of normalcy mattered most. Warm bread, a routine, a roof. These things turned a prison into a lifeline for many. Some men begged to stay after the war ended. Most histories focus on battles and politics, but what really happened was more unexpected than the usual explanation. There was another layer to their choice, something that would reshape lives long after the war. Most of what people assume about captivity and punishment is not entirely accurate. The truth ends up being stranger and more human than the common story. The immediate consequence was social. German prisoners, shaped by Nazi hierarchy, often found themselves taking orders from black American soldiers. Here is how it worked and why it mattered. Inside the wire, the real stakes were about authority and survival. Guards expected open defiance, and they feared riots or escapes. What could have gone wrong was not just violence, but a collapse of control that would spill beyond the camp. What puzzled officers and townspeople was why the obvious solutions failed. Harsh punishment, strict separation, and constant surveillance did not stop splits among the prisoners. Loyalty to the old regime did not turn every man into the same enemy. This confusion changed how commanders thought about discipline. The forgotten shortcut was social, not military. Small routines took root. Uniforms and rank meant something. Prisoners set their own rules and policed each other, often more effectively than the guards. Daily habits, quiet rituals, and peer pressure kept a fragile order in place. The expected fix was force. Commanders planned isolation or harsh crackdowns. That plan misread the reality. Die-hard Nazis organized secretly, while many others simply wanted to put the war behind them. Separating factions sometimes ignited the very violence the commanders feared. The ironic truth was simple. The smallest things held the most power. A uniform, a schedule, a grudging respect. They created stability. Men who met prejudice at home now exercised authority inside the camp. Freedom and control shifted in quiet, unexpected ways. But this is the piece everyone overlooks. On screen, the words, hidden lines, quiet tensions. A simple breakfast could redraw the line between bare survival and a life worth living. Here is how it worked and why it mattered. Morning trays piled with scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee offered more than food. For men who had lived on watery soup and hard bread, the abundance felt like a small miracle. Breakfast became a sign that something had changed. That change came with risk. These were prisoners, fenced in and watched. The obvious solution would have been to treat them like enemies, to withhold comforts and hope that punishment kept order. That did not explain what happened. The forgotten trick was routine and small choices. Daily meals served reliably, medical checkups and medicine when needed. Canteens using scrip, camp money let men buy chocolate, canned peaches, playing cards, soap, and even a Coca-Cola. Ledgers read like wish lists, choice returned. People assumed more and better supplies would solve everything. They thought large gestures or big shipments would end the problems. Those ideas failed because they missed the human rhythm. Supplies without structure slip away. Luxury without predictability does not restore dignity. The irony is simple. The smallest freedoms, picking a snack, trading a cigarette, sitting with a book, mattered most. Daily life inside the wire was steady and strangely generous. Red Cross inspectors recorded calories, with daily totals often topping 2,800, sometimes reaching 3,000. But here is where it gets strange. Many prisoners described eggs not seen in years. White bread, soft as cake, coffee poured without ration. Some joked they had never eaten so well, not even before the war. Most people assume captivity equals only deprivation. In this case, that assumption flips. Safety plus routine, even inside fences, offered a kind of dignity that long years of hunger and bombing had erased. Around the camp, beyond work hours, men read letters, played soccer, watched movies, listened to music. The structure was strict and the freedoms were small, but those small freedoms rebuilt a sense of normalcy that felt almost fragile. Overlay 1 at 50 seconds to 54 seconds. Phrase, not what you expect. Use quick visual resets like a map, zoom, a black and white clip, and a short sound cue to change pace. Overlay 2 at 2 minutes 10 seconds to 2 minutes 14 seconds. Phrase, a different truth. Most of what people assume about life inside the wire is not quite accurate. The truth ends up being quieter and more unexpected, a reminder that dignity can arrive on a tray, and routine can be the most radical kindness of all. A day's work outside the fence did more than pass the hours. It rebuilt a sense of normal life for men who had known only ruin. That small, steady routine changed the stakes. Without extra hands, harvests would have failed, barns would have stood empty, and whole communities risked hunger. At first, the solution seemed obvious: lock them away, feed them, and wait. But that approach did not fix the deeper problem. The shortage of labor was not just a logistics issue, it was a social one. People worried about safety, and farmers worried about trust. Machines and short-term crews could not replace the steady, experienced hands the fields needed. Then, a simple idea took hold. Prisoners of war were hired out to local growers. Men climbed onto trucks at dawn, headed for wheat fields and orchards that rolled for miles. The air by noon smelled of cut hay and fresh earth. Farm contracts signed with the War Department turned those men into much-needed workers. Mildred Peterson, a Kansas farmer, kept careful notes in her 1944 logbook. She wrote, "We worried at first, but they were grateful, eager to work, and had stories about starvation back home." But here is where it gets strange. People assumed the experiment would fail. They pictured fights, theft, or a breakdown in discipline. Some believed that keeping prisoners behind barbed wire was the only safe course. Instead, the daily grind of farm life exposed those assumptions. Language barriers and uniforms still mattered, yet shared tasks and shared meals wore those edges down. Laughter over spilled apples or a clumsy joke bridged distance in ways no policy could. In the end, the irony was quiet and powerful. The smallest, most human gesture worked best. Sitting under a tree, sharing bread and sandwiches, prisoners of war and American farmers traded stories and, slowly, trust. Some men admitted they did not want to return to what they had left. Townspeople who had grumbled began to see gratitude and skill where they had seen only the enemy. There was more beneath the surface. The fields became common ground, a place where survival, routine, and a little hope could be shared, no matter which side of the fence you started on. Most of what people assume about those camp fields is not quite accurate. The real story is quieter and stranger. What happened there was not only about labor, it was about how ordinary work can repair the simplest and deepest fractures of war. They begged to stay. After the war, many German prisoners refused the chance to go home, and that single fact forced commanders and diplomats to rethink everything. Here is how it worked, and why it mattered. The stakes were enormous. Officials worried about security, international law, and the political fallout of delayed repatriation. Paperwork alone could not solve what people were living. On January 4, 1946, the War Department issued General Order No. 12. The message was simple: German prisoners were to be sent home, no exceptions. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, the commandant read the directive, expecting order and swift compliance. Instead, resistance surfaced almost at once. But here is where it gets strange. The forgotten shortcut was not a legal trick or a military maneuver. It was small and human. Regular meals, steady work, and respectful treatment changed how men imagined their futures. Those simple conditions turned cages into temporary communities, and loyalty followed. What people assumed would stop that was force and bureaucracy. Officials thought memos and escorts would move everyone out. That plan failed. Men who had once dug a 178-foot tunnel to escape now begged not to leave. Letters, petitions, hunger strikes, and quiet refusals filled the files. The irony is sharp. The policy assumed that any freedom was the answer. For many prisoners, returning to bombed cities and uncertain futures felt like punishment, not release. The smallest, most ordinary comforts had become more powerful than orders from Washington. Text overlay 1 at 50 seconds to 54 seconds read, "Not what you expected." There is another layer. Official memos spoke of law and speed, but inside the wire people wrote about family, food, and safety. Personal stories collided with policy, and the collision exposed a gap between paperwork and lived life. Use quick map zooms, a black and white clip, and a short sound cue as visual pattern breaks. Text overlay 2 at 2 minutes 10 seconds to 2 minutes 14 seconds read, "This changes the story. Most people assume the repatriation directive failed because of disorder or bad planning. The assumption flips when you listen to the men who lived it. What kept them in place was not coercion, but the quiet dignity of steady days. In the end, the real twist is this. Most of what people assume about repatriation is not accurate. The truth is stranger and quieter. That unexpected human factor changed outcomes in a way no bureaucratic plan could foresee. They begged not to go home, and later they begged to stay. That was the consequence, and it altered small towns across America. Here is how it worked and why it mattered. By the winter of 1947, a surprising pattern showed up in community notices and official records. Former German prisoners were applying to immigrate, asking to remain where they had once been held. The risk was obvious. Returning to Germany meant rubble, missing jobs, scattered families, and empty streets. For many men, the choice was no longer between two countries. It was between despair and hope. The mystery is this. Most people assume the obvious solution would fix everything. Go home, rebuild, reunite. That did not happen. Letters from ex-prisoners described houses gone, neighbors gone, work gone. Freedom turned out to be more complicated than simply walking through a gate. The shortcut was not a legal loophole or a clever form. It was simple human contact. American farmers, sponsored workers, townspeople shared meals, and the humane treatment they had seen offered a model of ordinary life. The fences that once held them became, in unexpected ways, a doorway to a new start. Kindness plus steady work proved more persuasive than policy papers. What failed was the big plan, official repatriation, and the idea that people would naturally return to their pre-war lives assumed stability that no longer existed. Governments could move people on paper, but they could not rebuild neighborhoods overnight. The practical supports that make life possible were missing, and the familiar solution collapsed. The irony is sharp. The smallest, most human gestures outperformed grand strategies. Men who had been prisoners saw a life worth choosing. They applied, found sponsors, and in many cases, stayed. The result was an unexpected reshaping of communities and records. But here is where it gets strange. Records keep revealing small reunions, steady sponsorships, farm hands becoming neighbors, and towns holding quiet commemorations. VidRush overlay 1 suggestion at 050 to 054. Text suggestion, not what you remember. Most people think freedom is simple, just a matter of leaving. For these men, the assumption flips. Freedom meant choosing where to begin again, and that choice changed everything. There is another layer. Towns kept the memory alive, and official files show a slow, steady trickle of applications and reunions that tells a different story. VidRush overlay 2 suggestion at 210 to 214. Text suggestion, the real choice was here. Webturn, map zooms, black and white clips. So, freeze frame questions. Most of what people assume about wartime movements is not accurate. The truth ends up being quieter and stranger. What really happened is more unexpected than the myth, and that is the final, soft revelation. Most stories end with labels, with people sorted into categories. The experience of German prisoners in America forces us to rethink who we call enemies and how we practice empathy. As new conflicts redraw borders and loyalties, the treatment of the powerless sends a message that reaches far beyond any fence. In the end, small acts mattered more than sweeping plans. Dignity proved the most radical policy. That quiet truth is the real legacy.